Hello, everyone. Happy New Year. Welcome to the Rome, Where Are We? The next chapter of The Nature of Order is going to be coming out Monday. And so today, please enjoy this glimpse into the Rome course. So, like, share, and subscribe as always. Please, if you're curious about this, we're having great discussions. We're going to have our 2 hour class discussion tomorrow. If you want to find out more about that, find out about the other recordings, find out about the book that we're making, find out about this great course, the fantastic people who are contributing, John David Ebert, who set up a great situation with the school. Follow the link below to the John David Ebert School for Arts and the Humanities. On we go. Things are really cooking now. Previously on Rome, Where Are We? We got right up to the point of Sulla and Marius, and now we are stepping into Triumvirate Forged. So we're going now into the bit where we involve Cato, Pompey, Crassus, Caesar, and Cicero. I'm not going to be giving a deep background in summary. A lot of this is about analysis. So, plenty of places to look for if you're not familiar with all the names here. I know a lot of the students, we're going to be building up from what we know here, jumping right midstream. So we start with Cato, our look at Cato the Younger. So he was an orphan, interestingly enough. Plutarch is always interested in the psychology of people. And I think with a little bit of psychological speculation, it seems like he had a very intellectual bent, that he didn't learn things right away, but once he did learn them, he really learned them. The guy rarely smiled. He mostly kept to himself. He had, and even from his infancy, his speech, his countenance, all his childish pastimes, he discovered an inflexible temper, unmoved by passion and firm in everything. And I think it's interesting. I think we've all come across people that are like this. Plutarch says of him that, and I think this is very interesting, a little bit sad. He's saying those who receive with the most pains and receive education with the most pains and difficulty remember best. The new thing they learn, as it were, burnt and branded on their minds. For to learn is to submit, to have something done to you. This is very far from, Plato quoting Socrates saying, "Oh, wisdom begins in wonder," philosophia, the great love of wisdom. The Roman attitude towards, even Plutarch being a Greek, the Roman attitudes towards education were much different than the earlier Greek attitude to it. That it had to do with discipline, with submitting, with fighting against it. And so his tutor was named Sarpedon. Sarpedon, for those of you think back to dinosaur names, that means lizard tooth, was the name of his Greek tutor, who was probably a slave. And then it was very important. This is a great story about Cato, who later became a senator, involved. He opposed the Triumvirate. Cato did. Sulla, who was a friend of the family, at times sent for Cato. This is a key moment when Cato was a teenager. It tells you about the man he would become. For Cato and his brother to see them and walk with them, he showed favor to them. Sarpedon, full of the advantages that would be, as well as for the honor and safety of his scholars, would often bring Cato to wait upon Sulla at Sulla's house, which for the multitude of those that were being carried off in custody and tormented there, literal torture happening in the house. These are the times of the proscriptions during Sulla's dictatorship. The place looked like a place of execution. Cato was then 14 years old, and seeing the heads of the men said to be of great distinction cut off heads, brought thither, and observing the secret sighs of those who were present, he asked his tutor, "Why does nobody kill this man?" "Because," said Sarpedon, "they fear him, child, more than they hate him." "Why then," replied Cato, "did you not give me a sword that I might stab him and free my country from this slavery?" Sarpedon, hearing this, and at the same time seeing his countenance, the countenance of Cato, swelling with anger and determination, took care thenceforward to watch him strictly, lest he should hazard any desperate attempt. Thus, the character of Cato. So, when he found himself of the right age to marry, Plutarch writes that, having never before known any woman, he was never with a woman previously before he was with his wife. This is the exact opposite of Sulla. Sulla, who was partying around with people in the theater scene. Sulla, who had a sugar mama who was a prostitute who gave him lots of money. Cato is very much the opposite of this. Very much in the form, very much more like the Scipii, like the old Romans. And he's Cato the Younger. His great-grandfather or something like that was Cato the Elder, the famous one who said, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed, in the Third Punic War. He did serve in the army during the Third Servile War, the war against Spartacus. He served with him. He didn't get a chance to get much honor because the people above him weren't very good or responsible generals, so says Plutarch. And this is in part, here's where he and Pompey first come to cross paths in a way, before either of them are involved directly in politics. When he was in Antioch, he was in Syria. Cato was, and there was a huge crowd of people outside of Antioch, all dressed up, all waiting, all in a line. And apparently Cato was a commanding officer, and these people came up to him, and the oldest man there, who was, I guess, the guy in charge of like the mayor of Antioch, so to speak, comes up and is holding a scepter and a laurel, right? Symbols of office, symbols of rulership, and walks up to them and says something along the lines of, "Oh, we knew that Pompey was coming." And this is Cato. And so that's another kind of figuration of what's been happening here. It's important to remember that a generation before all this happened, and this would have been, I believe, sometime in the 80s BC. So in something like 140s BC, at the close of the Republic's wars in Greece against the Macedonians and the Seleucids, a roving Roman army could easily mean that your town or city would get sacked, destroyed, and burned for supporting the quote-unquote wrong faction. These Syrian people in Antioch, Greeks among them, were taking no chances when they saw Cato's legions and simply assumed that allegiance to Pompey was in order. This was kind of the like the abused spouse situation that these near constant wars had left the Mediterranean in. It's important to remember the traumatized state of many of these places. So, when he was in office, he actually balanced the budget. When he served, he oversaw the budget. He made it appear that the state might be rich without oppressing the people. There's something these days, an institution which really screws around with statistics. If you pay attention to what they do, I don't think they do a good service to Cato's name. They call themselves the Cato Institute. Well, this is what they admire. It's the stern conservatism of Cato, that among the Romans in the late imperial era, he was uncorrupted, uncorruptible, and he wanted a low budget, a balanced budget with low taxes. And so that's what they admire. And then they publish fishy statistics about public transportation, among other things. Anyway, that's a personal axe I have with to grind with the Cato Institute, beyond the scope of this course. So even when he exited office, he kept a close watch on the budget. He stayed in the Senate and was like a deficit hawk, always looking at what the budget was, and he was always looking over some document or other with his cloak around it in the Senate as everyone else was coming in and out. And he would sit there a little bit like James Madison did. He would arrive early and notice who was talking to who had alliances with what, and would just be this great political sponge to see what people were doing and how people were behaving, so that he would react accordingly to get done what he wanted to do. He was a very meticulous man. But I thought it very odd that he would sit in public and create something private in public like that. So, and at the end of our little section on Cato, that when Pompey came back after being declared imperator, before that meant the king of the world, before that meant emperor like we understand it, it just meant kind of like commander-in-chief, generalissimo, something like that. When Pompey was given imperium over the Mediterranean in the east and everything 50 miles inland, he came back from this triumph and he reached out privately to Cato, apparently using the kind of gossipy friendship of the women of the families, sent the women of his family to the women of his family. And again, if anyone says, oh, Rome is patriarchal, it's not a black and white situation. The women are having a very important diplomatic role here. And Cato resents how he feels. Pompey is using these roles of the matriarchs of these families irresponsibly. And he rejects the offer of strategic alliance, which the women of both families were excited about. They thought, this is good. Our families are going to help each other. We're going to share in all of this wealth from the east. Why not? That was their perspective. However, Cato saw the corruption inherent in this, and he said to the messenger, go, Munatius, and tell Pompey that Cato is not assailable on the side of the women's chamber. I am grateful indeed for the intended kindness, so long as his actions are upright. I promise him friendship more sure than any marriage alliance, but I will not give hostages to Pompey's glory against my country's safety. So, and then this Plutarch notes that really, even though the women of the families, and probably a lot of men in the families, were very disappointed at this, it later came out that Pompey was utterly corrupt in how he was bribing elections. And so Cato said to his family, look, aren't you glad I made that decision? Presumably people were at least somewhat thankful. And Plutarch steps back and notes that it was, however, a grand strategic mistake. It was a tactical victory, a moral victory, but a grand strategic mistake in that, but how could anyone have foreseen this? As this potential alliance between Pompey and Cato floundered, Pompey then made envoy to Julius Caesar, which, as Plutarch says, and that match was made, uniting Caesar's and Pompey's power, had well nigh ruined the Roman Empire and did destroy the Commonwealth, that being John Dryden's 19th century Victorian style, how he translated res publica, the republic. And so you could see the roots of the Triumvirate right there in Cato's rejection of Pompey's alliance. Into Pompey himself, even though in terms of age, honorifics, Crassus would be next. No, Pompey shoves his way right in there in the narrative. So he was so much of a trust fund baby. So it's said, Plutarch opens it by making a comparison to mythology, that Rome is to Pompey as Prometheus. The people of Rome regarded Pompey as Prometheus regarded Hercules. It's like, oh, your father hurt me and put me in chains, and then you're the one who comes and breaks them. So that was kind of a knowing, interesting thing with that. And apparently there are all these connections to Zeus. There are all these Plutarch makes all these mythological connections to Zeus with Crassus. At a time, he even retreats into a cave when his life is in danger and stays there for 8 months, and then comes out like almost gestation, which I thought was interesting. Like Zeus going to Crete to hide from Saturn. So his father apparently got struck by lightning. Again, another Zeus thing, whether that was true, maybe it was true, but that's a very Plutarch thing to say. So when he was very young, maybe when he was an old teenager, I think when he was about 17, his father died, and this was during the Marius versus Sulla civil war, the Marian civil war. And when he was young, Apparently, he looked a little bit like Alexander the Great, with his portrait bust, which I've put on the reading, and anybody can Google it. You can kind of see he didn't look like him when he was older, and Alexander never really got old. But you could see when he was young, he had kind of that like ambitious, tilted head Alexander look to him. But it went to his head when he was growing up. People just called him Alexander, like a fun little nickname, and so that just went straight into his psyche. And then when he was older, he would do things like defeat a great king in the east, just like Alexander did, a king who kept escaping, just like the Persian foe of Alexander did, and then he had this cloak that everybody said was Alexander's that he would wear and hold and walk around with like it was a security blanket, like it was his whoopee laying on his lap. He was a little bit obsessed with Alexander the Great. So, and he was constantly seeking approval from people. There was a woman, Flora, the courtesan, and that she would talk, even when she was fairly old, she would be very familiar with Pompey, and apparently she thought she desired Pompey, is what Plutarch delicately implies here, and that Pompey spent so much money to satisfy this woman because he wanted her approval. He wanted the approval of Cato. He wanted the approval of the Senate. It's like he wanted his father's approval was taken away from him by a stroke of lightning, and he desperately craved that kind of approval and validation and living up to his father's approval, which he knew he could never hear. And that seems to be very psychologically powerful for how Pompey lived his life. And it is poignant and a little bit sad and tragic, as ridiculous as Pompey would sometimes get. But he was also extremely competent and extremely talented when he was given direction. He never really had independent direction. That was one of his fatal flaws. But he even, with the various women that he would chase around with, he would embezzle the public revenue to gratify their luxury. So puts Plutarch, that he would go out on dates on the public dime, like big ones. So, as a young man, his father was fighting the Populares against Cinna in the Marian Civil War, and there was a plot against his life. And instead of doing so, this also shows you a little bit what he was like. The plot against his life, instead of trying to find the guy who would kill him and discipline the guy, this is what Pompey does. And he's maybe like 19 when this happens. At supper, he gets really drunk, and then he kind of walks outside of the camp and like camps outside the camp. And then the guy who's going to kill him comes up with a sword, and he actually made up his bedclothes like an 80s TV show. He made up his bedclothes to look like he was in it and went outside the camp totally drunk. And the guy who's going to kill him comes in and starts vigorously stabbing the cushions. And Pompey just kind of comes in, and then he's in the midst, and then everybody in the camp is like, what? No, you're trying to kill Pompey. And the camp is in complete chaos with everybody fighting each other because they think their general has been assassinated. And then Pompey comes in, and I don't know what the heck he thought he was going to do, but he comes in, and the only way that he can think of to restore order is he goes about in the midst of them crying and throws himself on the ground in front of the whole camp and lay there in the middle of the road, blocking the exit to the camp, crying, bidding those that were going to march away that if you're going to leave this camp, you have to step on me to do it. Pompey Magnus, ladies and gentlemen. And then no one wanted to step on Pompey. So they stayed, and order was restored. Great leadership. And during the Civil War, right after the death of his father was accused of embezzling stuff. So Cinna, there was, I might have to do, just for the file size, I might have to do a part 1 and part 2 because there's so many good things to cover today, and we're already at 30 minutes. How far are we? We're about a quarter of the way through, ladies and gentlemen, for today. So Cinna being slain, Carbo was more senseless than he. So this is the guy is the really radical almost communistic populares that took over in this revolution with Marius. He was in this place in Italy at this time. Pompey was in Picenum in Italy, in his father's lands, just kind of as Plutarch puts it, spent some time amusing himself. And then he doesn't make his own decisions. This is another thing of him not making his own decisions. When all the people around him heard about the elder, that Pompey's father, Strabo, had died, and that the Sulla needed help, they all went to go help Sulla. And then when he saw everybody else doing it, well, he decided to go and brought 2 of Daddy's legions with him. Thus, he entered onto the scene of the Civil War. So when moving along here, so he goes through the Civil War. He's first to notability, and then he goes down to Sicily. Here, he gets a series of commissions. He's ordered to do this. He's ordered to do that. The older men who were in charge were saying pretty much, okay, we know that we need you to do this, we need you to do that. The old men literally had in Pompey someone that would fight their battles for them. He went wherever they told him to go, and he did whatever they told him to do. So he goes to Sicily, and he's supposed to put down the some disorder there. And everyone, he was sent with a large force, and the foe immediately leaving the whole island to him. And he was received well by everybody there, except for the Mamertines in Messina. The Mamertines, that might ring a bell for some of you. The Mamertines were the people upon whom the fulcrum of the Punic War turned. They were responsible for the entire entanglement of Rome's control overspilling the borders of Italy, and the empire being created to begin with. They had been granted, because they were on the side of Rome during the Punic Wars, and right away at the First Punic War, they had a special charter. They had a constitutional charter saying that they could govern themselves. Pompey didn't like that. Pompey wanted them to do whatever he said. And they protested this, and this is a famous thing. I had this misattributed, and maybe even Carlin had this misattributed. I thought it was Caesar saying this too. Caesar said something else smart to the priests at the Temple of Saturn later on, but here, this is the attribution of this famous quote. Pompey going up to the Mamertines in Messina, pleading for their civil liberties, and his answer, he said sharply, what? Will you never cease prating of laws to us that have swords by our sides? So this is an important point of departure in our narrative, where the shift, all pretense of legalism is shoved aside for naked exercise of military power. And this will become more and more prominent. The story from here to the end of the Republic is basically a story of the faction in Rome that apologizes for naked power and the faction in Rome that does not apologize for naked power. That's one way of understanding it. And he was known as the Adolescent Butcher. That was his new nickname. Pompey commanded a man that had been thrice consul of Rome to be brought in fetters to stand at the bar, he himself sitting upon the bench in judgment, judge, jury, and executioner, examining the causes with the formalities of law to the offense and the indignation of all that were present, and afterwards ordered him to be taken away and put to death. And then there was another guy who had to... Plutarch gets into some purple detail there. A guy who was taken up to the gallows or to be beheaded, however they were going to do it. And let me put it this way. He really had to go to the bathroom, and Pompey let him suffer and be humiliated and probably laughed about it. Plutarch includes this to show that side of Pompey. And he gets called Pompey Magnus after he goes to North Africa. After Sicily, he gets ordered again by Sulla to go down into Africa. He had to put down some revolts there to enforce Roman rule in this fresh empire. And it was there that they started to call, he was going to be replaced. Now here, Sulla thought, okay, this guy's doing his job. I'm the one in charge. I can tell the armies to do what I want. I'm going to replace him with another general. I don't want him getting too uppity. Well, what happened? Well, he got very uppity. Apparently his soldiers didn't want him to be replaced. This is the beginning of the soldiers being loyal to the general instead of being loyal to SPQR, to the people in Senate of Rome. And it was at this point that the soldiers started to give him the title of Pompey Magnus, Pompey the Great. And he would walk around and he told everyone that he should be called by that name. And then he comes back. He had never really held any political office. He comes back and says, well, I've won these great victories. Where's my triumph? Sulla explains to him, you're not a consul. You're not elected to anything. There were even other great Romans who won great victories. They never even asked. They didn't have a triumph. They weren't asked for it. And then, apparently, Pompey Magnus, says to him, and I think this is very important religiously, he says to Pompey was not daunted, but bade Sulla remember that more people would worship a rising sun than a setting sun, as if to tell him that Pompey's power was increasing and Sulla's power was waning. Sulla didn't really hear what was being said, supposedly, but observing a sort of amazement and wonder in the looks and gestures of those that did hear them, he basically said, "Excuse me? Can you repeat that?" And when he said it again, Sulla seemed astounded at Pompey's boldness, and then cried out two times, "Let him triumph! Let him triumph! Let him have his great victory parade, where they will build monuments to him." So, and it was at this point where you get the story of he wants to bring elephants. He wants to bring North African war elephants into the city, but they can't fit through the gate. And so this guy who would bribe, this is an interesting, when it was legalism that was public, this guy who would bribe the elections, infamously, was so concerned about following the rules of the pomp and celebration that he wanted to proceed with his elephants through the city, but he couldn't get them through the southern gate at the Appian Way, which, by the way, may have been the so-called Arch of Drusus, the Arch of Gaius Marius. He couldn't fit the elephants through there. So very disappointed, he had to just be in a chariot with horses instead of being in a chariot with elephants like he wanted to be. Put up the horses, fit through the gate, waved at the crowds, slave behind him holding the wreath, whispering, "Remember you are mortal, memento mori." He had his triumph. He also had a second triumph. 2 triumphs in one lifetime. This was without even really having any political office. It was noted by Plutarch that he wanted glory more than power. That was probably true. He got used by other people. So he went to Spain. That was his next thing. He goes to Spain. And here's where he goes back into Italy, as chance would have it, Plutarch says, right at the height of the Servile War, the Spartacus War. This is where he runs into Crassus. Crassus had basically taken care of the entire thing, but Pompey steals all the thunder and takes all the credit, and then he comes in and captures a bunch of people who were running away from Crassus, and then writes a letter to his daddy's friends in the Senate and saying, "Look what I did. I ended the war." That's how he got his second triumph. Crassus hated this. There was a great rivalry between the two, which Caesar's great entree to power was as a mediator between these two most influential people, Pompey and Crassus, who hated each other's guts. Caesar realized, if I can get them to get along and I can ride their coattails, well, he did go far. So the second triumph was given. Crassus is very upset. When it was always said that when people said, "Oh, Pompey Magnus is coming," Crassus would just smile and say, "Oh, Pompey the Great? Oh, really? How big is he?" He would make that joke all the time. Then the next thing that Pompey does, he's always incredibly busy, is that he is sent to take care of the pirates. These are the same pirates that captured Julius Caesar a little bit before this. And they had watchtowers and beacons all along the seacoast. It's very important to remember. I thought that watchtower and beacon part was important to note, how sophisticated these people were. You got to realize they were sending light signals to each other. They would have sent coded signals to say when a fleet is coming, to spread intelligence and communications militarily all along the coast. So say if someone was coming along the southern edge of Greece, probably within a matter of hours or maybe like a day and a half, you could, by line of sight, with a couple of minutes for each step, send the message by those beacon towers across to Cilicia, which is right in the corner of where Syria and Turkey come together on the coast. And you can send messages back and forth like that. So this had been very formidable. These people, the pirates, had stepped into the power vacuum that Mithridates, the king in the east, the guy that we've kind of analogized a little bit to Putin, with that power vacuum, with the Seleucids being torn down by both the Romans and Mithridates, there was a lot of piracy. If you could imagine Wagner Group running amok after some outcome of the Ukrainian war, that would be a close analogy as to what was going on. But he basically was logistically brilliant and tuned that up. He was given imperium. This is when we have the title of imperator. He was given direct personal rule over the lands of the East and all the people in it, including kings. There were kings over there. This is when there's a somewhat tense situation where the Hasmonean dynasty, the independent Judea that had been independent ever since the Maccabees, ever since the first Hanukkah, that he was even supposedly kind of given by decree rule over them, and there had to be a kind of tense negotiation there with Pompey and the East. Any place 50 miles inland from the coast in the East that wasn't already set up by Rome, Pompey had direct personal control over. Again, this is another big wedge being driven into the Republic. There's a bit about Catullus. The Catiline conspiracy is very important. That fits into a lot of things. There's no time to go over that right now. But eventually, where the narrative ends for today here is with Pompey eventually capturing Mithridates. And being like Alexander, he defeats the great poison king. The cloak of Alexander in his hand, he returns to Rome. And there will be part 2 coming up. Here we are in part 2 of Triumvirate Forged in order to accommodate some of the server limits. So now we get on into Crassus, the life of Crassus. He was educated. He didn't. Plutarch gives the impression that he did not grow up particularly rich. He was probably far more wealthy than most Roman people, and even than most Roman citizens, but he was educated in a little house together with 2 of his brothers, who were both married in their parents' lifetime. And one thing that he did is that after his brother died, he married his brother's widow, which apparently Plutarch considers to be a really solid, good guy thing to do, that you're not going to chase around some other woman, that your brother's widow needs someone to take care of her and her family, and you step up to the plate and you marry your brother's widow. And he considered that a very noble thing to do. However, it was noted that Crassus would kind of chase after the ladies outside of his marriage once, and this is indicative of his character. He once was accused of being far too familiar with a Vestal Virgin. And this particular Vestal Virgin, she was acquitted of ever being sexy with the guy, but she apparently gave, or something, the lands, very rich lands that she owned that were somewhat outside Rome. She had a lot of estates that she owned, and Crassus got title to those, so he loved her for her money. She just happened to be a Vestal Virgin. And apparently he had Plutarch notes, and this is something about the ancient mindset. Plutarch notes that he took a very active role in maintaining his household, that he would educate the slaves himself, that he was kind of a good, in the Roman sense, he was a good HR person. That he would teach them themselves. He knew that the smarter and more capable and better treated his slaves and servants were, the richer he would be, the better the household would run. And Plutarch admires that. That's something which is a bit odd for us to contemplate. That seems a conflict of values to us, obviously, but it's important. It's important to note that he had this outlook that. He saw something that we would call non-zero-sum gain, which probably helped lead to his fabulous wealth. On the other side of the coin, somewhat, he was famous for buying houses that were on fire. That was the other thing. Maybe some of you know about that, the original fire sales in real estate. That when Sulla was literally burning down the city of Rome, Crassus would go and buy up all the burnt houses and then come with a big team of architects. He probably had a bunch of masons and artisans and architects in his household that he was teaching, maybe reading some Vitruvius anyways, but bring his HR team to come in and build condos. That's what he would do. So anyways, he's running away. He's running away from Cinna and Marius. He's running away from the Populares, who killed Crassus's father and brother. He flees to Spain and hides in a large cave, going away like Zeus. He stays there for 8 months, comes out of hiding. So he had to live. He surrounded himself with so much wealth, but at a key moment in his young life, he was forced to live, to be homeless. That may have made an impression on him. Another thing that was very important, and this also comes up with Caesar, is that Caesar needed a lot of money. Caesar spent a lot of money in his campaigns, and with bribes, with games, with what we would call campaign ads, which in the Roman sense, the way you would do a campaign ad is that you'd have chariot races. You'd pay for games. You'd pay for theatrical events. You would build stuff for people. That was how that was done back then. Caesar got himself into office first. By doing this, he got so much debt and then wasn't able to pay it off. But Crassus goes up to him and gives him the money. And Caesar would have said something along the lines of, well, how do I repay you? And Crassus would have said something along the lines of, we'll see. Check in with me. Ask me later. Crassus would do this, is that he would buy allegiance. He would buy favors. And therefore, by, as Dan Carlin put it, the Bank of Crassus holding the debt of favors, that thereby become, at a certain point, the most influential and powerful man in Rome by power of debt. We already talked about how he took care of Spartacus. He was the guy who did that. And then there's a rivalry between him and Pompey. They both want to be consul. They end up being consul, even though they're arguing a lot. And this is kind of the, you could call this the Triumvirate. Caesar, we don't know exactly to what extent he was involved. He probably was, especially with Plutarch saying how Pompey, instead of approaching Cato, approached Caesar. And then Crassus has the financial connection to Caesar. Caesar's already there. He hasn't yet ascended into prominence, but these two guys, Pompey and Crassus, are both consul. And then as their term comes up, well, what are they going to do? They want to be consul. Do they want to be consul again? And then this guy, Aurelius, Onatius Aurelius, whom Plutarch calls an ordinary private person living in the country, mounted the hustings and declared a vision he had in his sleep. Jupiter, said he, appeared to me in a dream and commanded me to tell all of you that you should not suffer your consuls to lay down their charge before they are made friends. Seems a little suspicious, probably. He might have been put up to this by somebody, possibly Caesar, possibly Pompey or Crassus, but they're whipping up popular support to say, so they could pretend to say, oh no, oh, we can't be consuls again, oh no, come on, oh, you convinced us. So Crassus's consulship is coming up. This is important. Egypt at this point is reduced to being a tributary of Rome, which Plutarch calls a violent event. Plutarch must have had some appreciation for that. I believe that Plutarch was a priest of Isis, so he would have seen this as not great. Reducing Egypt to be a tributary to Rome, Catullus strongly opposed this. Catullus has had several appearances already that when Pompey was talking about, he also came up here and opposed Pompey's interests, that Caesar was supporting a law of Pompey very early on, and this was the law of the granting of imperium. Caesar was supporting it, supporting Pompey very early on. Catullus stood up to speak against the law, granting Pompey imperium, and then later Catullus speaks up against Egypt being added as a tax-paying tributary. Catullus is making some very powerful enemies, and we are going to see next time how in the Catiline conspiracy, or maybe in the discussion tomorrow, that ends up being very important. There's a real power shift, and it was pretty decisive. It's hard to tell what exactly happened in the Catiline conspiracy because so many people were either lying or had the motivation to lie. So then when they were both consuls, they were both proclaimed consuls again. Pardon the weed whackers. They cast lots as to who would be in charge of these new imperial lands in Spain and then in the east. And as Plutarch writes it, Syria fell to Crassus and the Spains to Pompey. There's a bit of foreshadowing there that, as anybody reading that would have known, Syria fell to Crassus, but Crassus would fall to Syria. Are we in Crassus? Yes, we're in Crassus. So the people, the common people of Rome, the non-senatorial class, they were rather pleased with this. This would mean more taxes, more revenue, more slaves, more big government, more spending, and all of those popular things. The conservatives among the elites didn't like it because they saw how this was fraying the rule of law. This was leading to a situation where people would, say, how dare you speak of laws to us when we have swords? And they knew the chaos that this had caused in the past and would continue to cause. So they've divided it like this. Caesar at this point is in Gaul. They've appointed Caesar his first 5-year term and then his second 5-year term in Gaul, where he goes and expands the empire even further. Crassus wanted to go and expand the empire to the east. Crassus had not had I don't think Crassus had a triumph. it bothers him that he feels that Pompey stole his triumph with that triumph in the Servile War against, because he was actually the one who stopped Spartacus. Crassus felt he deserved a triumph, so he wanted that glory. That was the one thing he had. He was the man who had everything, money, power, but he did not have the triumph. If he won a victory in the East, he would then get his triumph. He could call himself Parthicus, Crassus Parthicus, and come back from that in glory, even perhaps outdoing Pompey and saying that I'm the real Alexander. How about that? I got further than Pompey ever did. Caesar thought this was a good idea. Maybe it wasn't great for Caesar to encourage Crassus. Crassus goes off to the east. And this is rather profound, that apparently people had a very bad... It was one of those things where somebody says, I've got a bad feeling about this. A lot of people, and maybe Caesar thought that Crassus would get bumped off. I don't know. Hard to say. But as he was leaving the city on this campaign, he didn't leave at a good time of year for it. I believe he left kind of in either late fall or in the middle of winter. No one thought it was a great idea. Well, some people did, but a lot of people didn't. And this guy named Aetius tried to stop him, another senator. Aetius, therefore, running to the gate as the army is leaving, when Crassus was come thither, set down a chafing dish with lighted fire in it. And I've been to the place in Rome where this likely happened, down in the Alban fields. Lighted a fire in it, and burning incense and pouring libations on it, cursed him with dreadful imprecations, calling upon and naming several strange and horrible deities. In the Roman belief, and he would have been doing this probably as this nymphaeum dedicated to Athena that they were passing. So they were passing this area, which I think was they had passed all the great monuments that are outside of the city along the Appian Way. So kind of the weight of the ancestors would have been fresh on their minds. The piety of Pallas Athena, the war goddess of wisdom, she who helped Odysseus. In this context, and the Romans being very pious, he sets down a chafing dish with lighted fire in it. So he sets down a bowl of fire, burning incense and pouring libations on it. Curses Crassus with dreadful imprecations, calling upon and naming several strange and horrible deities. In the Roman belief, there is so much virtue in these sacred and ancient rites that no man can escape the effects of them, and that the utterer himself seldom prospers, so that they are not often used except in great emergency. And Aetius was blamed at the time for resorting to them, as the city itself, in whose cause he used them, would be the first to feel the ill effects of these curses and supernatural terrors. And indeed, Rome would suffer greatly. This was the beginning of the undoing of the Triumvirate, Crassus going off to the east where he would be killed. Without Crassus in the Triumvirate, a rift developed between Pompey and Caesar that never healed. Thus, the end of the Republic, as it so happened. Crassus arrived at Brundisium, that's the heel of Italy, and even though the sea was very rough, he didn't have patience to wait, and that sea does get choppy in the Mediterranean in winter. It'll be so calm and so amazing in the summer and just flat, and then in the winter it genuinely looks angry. The sea was very rough. He had not patience to wait, but went on board and lost many of his ships. Also, he lost many of his men. With the remnant of his army, he marched rapidly through Galatia, this is in Anatolia, where he met King Diotorus, which means the king of the divine bull. King Diotorus, who was a Celtic king in central Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, who, even though he was very old, was building a new city in what is now probably around near where Ankara is right now. Crassus scoffingly told this old king, "Your Majesty begins to build at the 12th hour." "Neither do you," said the king, "O general, undertake your Parthian expedition very early." He's saying, "You're not a spring chicken yourself there, general." For Crassus was then 60 years old and seemed older than he was. At first coming, things went as he would have had them on the campaign, for he made a bridge over the Euphrates without much difficulty, passed over his army in safety, and occupied many cities in Mesopotamia, which yielded voluntarily. But 100 of his men were killed in one of these cities, in which Apollonius was tyrant. By the way, that's a city, that's the city of Xenodotion in Osrhoene, near Nicephorum, near modern Al-Raqqa, in Syria. It's on the east banks of the Euphrates. It's straight south of Haran in Turkey, which was Kare, which is where, we'll get to it later, where Crassus met a horrible fate. And in this city, he took it by storm, plundered the gods. Freudian slip. He plundered the goods and sold its inhabitants. He was not making friends in the east, gallivanting around, plundering cities, selling people into slavery, insulting old Celtic kings. And he paid for it. That's what one of the things we'll be going on next time. Now we come to Gaius Julius Caesar. So much to go over in Caesar. We'll have to go through this rather quickly. But, of course, there's that the famous bit about "in that man goes many a Marius." I believe we've covered that before. That comes early on in this Plutarch. He had to run away from Sulla. Caesar had to run away from Sulla instead of running away from Marius. So he really kind of crossed the aisle to make allegiances with Crassus, and that would have been Caesar's doing. The clemency of Caesar, the idea of that he will put away what would be grudges to other men in order to make a pragmatic alliance. Very, very Caesar. Cicero was the first person who ever had suspicions of Caesar being dangerous to the Republic, so says Plutarch. We're beginning to see the split into populares and optimates. There were two factions in the city, and all monuments and statues to Marius had been ordered taken down. Caesar puts them up. Happened very early in his political career. That was a moment of prominence, and that was seen as that would be as if all MAGA hats were made illegal. And then someone goes around selling a bunch of MAGA hats and says, "Go ahead, put me in jail." Or someone goes around selling January 6th t-shirts and says, "Yeah, I'm going to wear this." Oh, I should be careful with what I'm saying. First time is tragedy, second time is farce. But it's the kind of thing you can imagine Kanye West doing. Maybe I should set a bowl of fire and pour libations in it, I don't know. So he's named Pontifex Maximus after Metellus, the high priest, dies. The Metelli were a very notable family who were at this point going from gain-sustained squander into the kind of profligate children who we will get to shortly. He becomes Pontifex Maximus, head priest. That includes the famous, amazing moment where he goes to win the election or lose the election, and he's so much in debt. And he gives his mother a kiss goodbye, and he says, "Mom, I'm going out for election day. If I don't come back, if I don't win, this will be the last time I see you. Bye, Ma." Caesar goes off. But, he won the election. It's one of the reasons he was in debt. He bribed so many people. But it was after that election that Crassus gives him all the money. So, at the Catiline conspiracy, unfortunately, there's no time to go into the Catiline conspiracy. That would have to be a whole thing there. But this was his first prominent political act, is that during the Catiline conspiracy, where Catullus and several conspirators and Caesar and Crassus were possibly implicated. Cicero thought they may have been involved, but there was no real evidence. This was a supposed conspiracy. The whole thing might have been made up, but it was a supposed conspiracy to overthrow the Republic and establish a kingdom. Catullus flees the city. He had two of his conspirators, Lentulus and Cethegus, were in custody. Cicero is speaking before the Senate and says, "These men must die. We need to kill them immediately. They're a threat to the Republic." Everyone is agreeing with Cicero. Cicero names himself father of the country. He has himself named given the title father of the fatherland for this. This was his year as consul and his great moment in politics that he foiled this conspiracy and great threat to the Republic, and it's going to be his crowning achievement that he is going to have these criminals executed. But wait, there was one man who stood up and said, are these Roman citizens? Yes, these are Roman citizens. Aren't all Roman citizens guaranteed trial, due process? That man who stood up was Julius Caesar. This kind of foiled things. So there was a split between Caesar and Cicero yet again. The Metelli come into this because there's another thing about the Publius Clodius affair. Publius Clodius then was Publius Clodius di Metelli. He was of the Metelli family, but he had his name changed because he wanted to be not noble. He wanted to reject he wanted to virtue signal and be a social justice warrior and had this kind of gangster chic of being a street guy. So instead of being Claudius, he was Clodius, which was more like a street accent way of saying it. So Caesar has a ceremony as Pontifex Maximus where he makes Clodius not a patrician anymore so that Clodius can become tribune of the people. Clodius then, as Caesar is in Gaul, Clodius acts because of this affair where Clodius is basically accused of horrible sacrilege and cross-dressing. No time to get into that, but Clodius dresses up like a woman and goes to have a tryst with his girlfriend in this ladies-only goddess religious party. He gets caught, the women all scream and nearly kill him. He gets put on trial for this. Cicero's the prosecutor. Caesar is on the stand. Caesar had divorced his wife, whom this guy Clodius was supposedly having an affair with. He divorces his wife, but says, no, I don't want to press charges. Cicero says, why are you doing that, Caesar? You involved? Caesar simply says, the wife of Caesar must be above suspicion. So that quick little statement kind of helped get Clodius Pulcher acquitted. Clodius Pulcher then has great loyalty to Caesar. Caesar keeps him as the man in charge while Caesar is off in Gaul. This guy kind of goes off the leash a little bit and starts running around with these gangs. Eventually the Senate gets burnt down. That all happens later. At the end of Caesar's time here, it's the end of Caesar Part 1. We're going to have Part 2 of the Triumvirate next week. It ends with this, with Clodius in our part of the Plutarch. That Pompey secured for Caesar the government of all of Gaul, both on this and the other side of the Alps, together with Illyricum and the command of 4 legions for 5 years. Cato made some attempts against these proceedings, but was seized and led off on the way to prison by Caesar, who expected that he would appeal to the tribunes to stop this. But when he saw that Cato went along without speaking a word, dutiful, honorable Cato, and not only the nobility were indignant, but the people also, out of respect for Cato's virtue, were following in silence. So Cato is trying to stop Caesar being appointed to military command in the province of Gaul. Caesar has Cato arrested. Cato leaves without protesting. And the Senate, like most of the Senate, basically stands up and says and turns their back to Caesar as if to say, as Dan Carlin put it, they would rather be in jail with Cato than in the Senate run by Caesar. And that was the first moment of Caesar really overstepping his bounds of power. And to show you how bad things had gotten, that there was a very old man, an old senator, who one day took occasion to tell Caesar that the senators did not meet because they were afraid of his soldiers. These were probably the gangs of Clodius. Caesar said, "Why don't you then why don't you stay at home because of that same fear?" To which this old man named Considius replied that age was his guard against fear. The small remains of his life were not worth much caution. Old Romans had a lot of gravitas. The most disgraceful thing that was done in Caesar's consulship was his assisting to gain the tribuneship for this same Clodius, who had made the attempt on his wife's chastity and intruded upon secret vigils. He was elected on purpose to effect Cicero's. Clodius was elected on purpose to create Cicero's downfall. Nor did Caesar leave the city to join his army until Clodius and Caesar had overpowered Cicero and driven Cicero out of Italy. Thus far, we have followed Caesar's actions before the wars of Gaul. After this, he seems to begin his course afresh and to enter upon a new life and scene of action. This, ladies and gentlemen, has been what we will be discussing for our 2-hour session on Saturday and for next time. Caesar in Gaul, Pompey holding his security blanket of the cloak of Alexander, Crassus dying at Carrhae, the end of the Triumvirate, and with it, of the Republic. Next time on Rome, Where Are We? Thank you for listening. Look forward to the upcoming discussion.